On the morning of October 4th, 1961, Andrea Russo hurried down the hallway of her home in Fresno, California. She rounded the corner into her 8-year-old son Tommy's room, and there was Tommy on the floor surrounded by toys. As Andrea expected, her son had not gotten dressed for school yet. Andrea couldn't help but smile, but at the same time they were running late and there was no time to play right now. So she grabbed some clothes from his dresser and then dropped down onto the floor next to him. She slipped his favorite red and white striped t-shirt over his head and then unfolded a new pair of blue jeans for him to step into. Then she handed him some sneakers and said, "Put those on." Andrea jumped to her feet and ran back to the kitchen. There, she grabbed 2 slices of bread and stuck them in the toaster, and when the toast popped back up, Andrea put the slices on a plate and sprinkled them with cinnamon and sugar, her son's favorite breakfast. With her son's breakfast in one hand, Andrea grabbed Tommy and led him out to the car, his shoes still untied. She helped her son climb into the back seat and then handed him his toast. As Andrea drove her son to school, she passed by huge fields of lush farmland where tomatoes, barley, and almonds were growing. She saw a small helicopter hovering over one farm, raining clear liquid down onto the crops below. Andrea knew the plane must be spraying the field with pesticides. For her, this was a familiar scene. Fresno was an agricultural town. But when Andrea turned around and looked into the back seat to check on Tommy, she saw him staring at the helicopter with wide eyes, shoving the last bites of cinnamon sugar toast into his mouth. He'd seen large industrial spraying machines before, but this helicopter was new and interesting. Andrea continued down the road away from the farm. She pulled up outside Tommy's elementary school just as the bell was ringing. She helped him out of the back seat, gave him a hug, and told him to have a good day. She watched him run inside, nearly tripping over his shoelaces. Then Andrea got back in her car and headed home. A few hours later, Andrea was in the laundry room folding Tommy's clothes when the telephone rang. She ran to the living room and picked up the call, and it was Tommy's teacher. The teacher sounded very concerned. She said that something seemed very off about Tommy. Normally, he was always smiling and paying attention in class, but today he'd been acting totally lethargic all morning. Instead of being involved in the lessons, he just kind of stared into space with his eyes glazed over. And when it was time for recess, he didn't even want to go outside. Andrea was surprised. Her son had seemed perfectly fine that morning, and he would never skip recess, even if he had a cold or a stomachache. So she knew he must be feeling really sick. She told the teacher she'd be there to pick him up soon. Andrea hung up the phone, grabbed her keys, and drove straight to the elementary school. As soon as she pulled up to the curb, she saw Tommy trudge out the front door. He dragged his feet with each step. He hadn't even bothered to put his backpack onto his shoulders. He just pulled it on the ground right behind him. When Tommy made it to the car, he crawled into the back seat and closed his eyes without saying a word. Andrea asked if he was okay, but all Tommy did was shake his head, no. Andrea had never seen her son like this before. Andrea worried that Tommy was more than just tired, so she called Tommy's pediatrician as soon as she got home. Luckily, the doctor could see them right away. At the pediatrician's office, a receptionist led them into an examination room and said the pediatrician would be there soon. Andrea helped her son up onto an exam table covered with a thin sheet of paper. She held his shoulders and looked into his eyes. They were glassy and unfocused. As soon as she let go of his shoulders, he laid down sideways on the exam table and shut his eyes. Andrea didn't know if she should wake him up or let him rest, but before she could decide, the doctor knocked softly on the door and then came into the room. The doctor was an older man with dark hair, the same pediatrician Tommy had had since he was a baby. Andrea was relieved to see a familiar face. She told the doctor about her son's sudden exhaustion that day and how his teachers were very concerned about him. Then she gently shook Tommy's shoulder and gradually he sat up. The pediatrician gave Tommy a quick examination. He checked the 8-year-old's pulse, his blood pressure, and temperature. He looked down the boy's throat and shined a light in his eyes. Then he turned to Andrea and said that all of Tommy's vital signs seemed normal. He didn't think there was anything to worry about. Tommy was probably just tired, so she should take him home and let him rest. Andrea hesitated. Tommy had never acted like this when he was just tired, so she had a nagging suspicion that something else might be going on here. But at the same time, she wanted to believe this doctor, so she ultimately just followed his advice. Andrea brought Tommy back out to the car and drove home. About 20 minutes later, she pulled into their driveway and walked around the car to help her son out of the back seat. However, when she opened the back door of the car, Tommy didn't even open his eyes. Andrea asked Tommy if he was okay, but he seemed confused, like he could barely form a thought. He was even more out of it than he had been earlier. Very concerned, Andrea got into the front seat and sped right back to the doctor's office. She parked her car, grabbed Tommy out of the back seat, and carried him inside. It had been less than an hour since they'd left, and the receptionist looked confused to see them again. But Andrea told her that they needed to see the doctor again right now. This was an emergency. The receptionist nodded and ran to get the doctor. But then suddenly, Tommy blurted out that he had to use the bathroom, and he got up and ran to the restroom so quickly that Andrea couldn't keep up. Tommy flung open the door and slammed it shut. From outside in the hall, Andrea could hear her son retching. Tommy vomited, and then he had diarrhea. When he came out of the bathroom, he looked absolutely miserable. By this point, the doctor had come out into the waiting area. He and Andrea helped Tommy walk to the exam room, and as soon as they got inside, Tommy collapsed onto the table, barely conscious. The doctor's eyes went wide. He raced over to Tommy and checked his vitals again. Then he turned to Andrea and told her Tommy's heart rate was extremely high. She asked him what was wrong, and he just shook his head. He had never seen anything like this before. But the doctor did say he knew someone who might be able to help. His name was Dr. John Conrad, and he was the leading pediatrician in the Fresno area, and he specialized in pediatric allergies. If anyone could identify what was causing Tommy's rapid decline, it was him. The doctor rushed out of the room to call Dr. Conrad, leaving Andrea alone with Tommy. Andrea felt so helpless. Her son was becoming desperately ill, and she couldn't do anything except watch as his eyelids fluttered and he struggled to breathe. Across town, Dr. John Conrad held the phone against his ear and jotted down the symptoms Tommy's pediatrician described. Dr. Conrad was an older man with white hair and clear-rimmed glasses. He'd spent many years practicing pediatric medicine and felt like he'd seen it all already. And as he eyed the list of symptoms he had just jotted down, he actually immediately came up with a theory about Tommy's illness. He suspected that the 8-year-old might have type 1 diabetes and could be on the verge of falling into a diabetic coma. Type 1 diabetes usually shows up during adolescence, but it can strike younger children too, and the symptoms can arise very suddenly. People with diabetes can't properly digest sugar, and so something as simple as eating a sugary breakfast or going too long without a snack can send them spiraling toward a diabetic coma. Dr. Conrad told the pediatrician to send Andrea and Tommy to the Valley Children's Hospital in Fresno, and he would meet them there. Dr. Conrad then immediately called that hospital and asked the staff to be ready to test Tommy for diabetes as soon as he and his mother arrived. Then Dr. Conrad ran out to his car and made his way to the hospital. Valley Children's Hospital was a single-story brick building that was lined with trees. When Dr. Conrad walked inside, a nurse with a long ponytail and blue scrubs approached him. The nurse told him that Andrea and Tommy were already there, and the diabetes test that Dr. Conrad had requested had come back. The results were negative, meaning whatever was happening to Tommy was not type 1 diabetes. And that wasn't all. As they walked towards Tommy's room, the nurse said they'd run other blood tests in addition to checking for diabetes. Now, most had come back normal, but Tommy's white blood cell count was extremely high, which meant his body was clearly fighting off something. Dr. Conrad thought about this. Most likely, Tommy was fighting off an infection, maybe in his intestinal tract, that would explain the vomiting and diarrhea. Dr. Conrad felt like he might be onto something, but he would need to examine Tommy himself to figure out more. Tommy was curled up in the hospital bed when Dr. Conrad came in. His mother hovered over him, looking totally exhausted and terrified. When she saw Dr. Conrad come in, she ran over, clasped his hand, and said how happy she was to see him. The doctor could feel the young mother's fear in her handshake, and it made him even more determined to get to the bottom of Tommy's illness as quickly as possible. Tommy almost looked like he was sleeping, except that his hands and feet were twitching. Dr. Conrad checked his pulse, and Tommy's heart was still racing. The doctor asked Tommy how he was feeling, but Tommy seemed too confused to even speak. In fact, he could barely even open his eyes. And when he did, Dr. Conrad saw that Tommy's pupils had constricted into 2 tiny black dots. The doctor wasn't sure what to make of the muscle twitches and the constricted pupils, but he still thought that Tommy might have an intestinal infection, so he wanted to examine the 8-year-old's abdomen. Dr. Conrad moved the blankets out of the way and very lightly pressed on the boy's belly, and immediately Tommy screamed in agony. The doctor pulled his hand away reflexively. The severity of Tommy's reaction really surprised him, but it also made an intestinal infection seem much more likely. Dr. Conrad wondered if maybe Tommy had consumed a relatively common bacteria called Shigella that often spreads in places like elementary schools. Thinking this could be the answer, Dr. Conrad asked hospital staff to run a test for Shigella because as soon as they got confirmation that that was what it was, they could begin treating Tommy. But 2 hours later, Dr. Conrad sat in the hallway outside of Tommy's room and read over the test results. Tommy had tested negative for Shigella infection. Dr. Conrad shook his head as he reviewed Tommy's symptoms. The boy was pale and feverish with extremely small pupils, his heart rate was abnormally high, his muscles were twitching, and his white blood cell count was elevated. The boy was experiencing confusion and extreme stomach pain. He seemed to be floating in and out of consciousness. Dr. Conrad put all these details together, and then he had a deeply unsettling thought. What if this boy has been poisoned? Dr. Conrad took a deep breath. Tommy's symptoms actually reminded him of a patient he'd once treated, a farmer who'd come down with sudden exhaustion, muscle twitches, and vomiting. That sounded a lot like what Tommy was going through. It turned out the farmer had been poisoned by the organic phosphates in the pesticides he applied to his crops. He had accidentally inhaled some of the chemicals in the process. Dr. Conrad wondered if maybe something similar could have happened to Tommy. Fresno was, after all, an agricultural community, so it was possible that the 8-year-old could have, in theory, inhaled pesticide by accident. Even a tiny amount would be enough to cause extreme symptoms within just a few hours. Dr. Conrad realized that he needed to act fast. Organic phosphates were powerful poisons. If he didn't give Tommy an antidote quickly, this little boy could die. 5 minutes later, Dr. Conrad rushed back into Tommy's room carrying a syringe that contained a medicine called atropine. The doctor carefully injected this drug into Tommy's arm as the boy lay completely still, except for the twitching in his hands and feet. It was the same medication that Dr. Conrad had used with that farmer, and he prayed this would work for Tommy too. While they monitored the boy's condition, Dr. Conrad asked hospital staff to run a blood test for organic phosphate poisoning. A few hours later, around 8:30 p.m., the results of that test came back. Dr. Conrad's hunch was correct. Tommy was suffering from organic phosphate poisoning. The doctor broke the news to Tommy's mother. He was still wondering where exactly the poison had come from, so he asked Andrea if she'd taken her son around any of the local farms recently. Andrea thought for a moment. She said she always drove by some fields while taking Tommy to school. That very morning, they'd passed a helicopter that was spraying a farm with pesticides, but she and Tommy had been inside the car with all the windows up. She told Dr. Conrad that she didn't understand how that could have made Tommy so sick. The doctor wasn't sure either. Whatever had happened, it seemed like a freak accident. Pesticide poisonings were actually very rare. What mattered was that Dr. Conrad had acted quickly and the atropine worked perfectly. By 10 p.m., Tommy was sitting up in his hospital bed. His color had come back, his muscles had stopped twitching, he was able to have a full conversation with the doctor. Tommy said his stomach pain was gone too, but he still felt really tired. Dr. Conrad told Andrea it would take a few days in the hospital for Tommy to make a full recovery, but her son would be okay. Then he asked her to schedule a follow-up appointment with him 1 week after Tommy was discharged, and then Dr. Conrad said goodnight and headed for home, satisfied that he'd solved the mystery. 6 days later, there was no trace of poison left in Tommy's system, and so he was finally healthy enough to go home from the hospital. Andrea packed up their belongings and led Tommy to the parking lot. He skipped along beside her, and instead of talking about his illness or his time in the hospital, he just chatted about his Tonka trucks. When they got in the car, Tommy jumped into the back seat without her help. He was so excited to go home. But despite how energetic her son seemed, Andrea still felt nervous. She was happy that Tommy was coming home, but she wouldn't feel at ease until the checkup with Dr. Conrad the following week. For the next 6 days, Andrea did not take any chances. She kept her son at home and resting in bed. She wouldn't let him go to school, play outside, or even leave the house. It actually wasn't until the day of his doctor's appointment the week after that Tommy finally swapped out his PJs for real clothes and finally walked outside. Andrea helped him into the back seat and drove to Dr. Conrad's office. The white-haired doctor greeted Tommy with a smile. He gave the boy a thorough examination and assured Andrea that her son was doing just fine. When Tommy heard that, he hopped up and tugged on Andrea's arm. She looked down at her son, who had a huge smile spread across his face, and he said he couldn't wait to go back to school and see his friends again. Relieved, Andrea thanked Dr. Conrad and headed back out to the parking lot. Tommy sprinted ahead of her, anxious to get back home. As Andrea drove through Fresno on the way home, she felt like she could finally breathe. Her son had never been that sick before. Seeing him suffer like that had been terrifying, and she hadn't been able to relax until just now, when Dr. Conrad promised that really everything was all right. And so now they could finally get back to their normal lives. Andrea turned into her neighborhood, looking forward to a weekend at home before Tommy went back to school. But then her son called out to her from the back seat. He said his stomach was starting to hurt again. When Andrea turned to look at him, she saw him breathing rapidly, and there were beads of sweat dripping down his forehead. All of Andrea's dread came rushing back. She immediately turned around and sped back to Dr. Conrad's office. As she drove, Andrea repeatedly checked on Tommy in the rearview mirror, watching his condition get worse and worse by the second. When they were about 10 minutes away, all the color suddenly drained out of Tommy's face. Then his whole body kind of went slack and he slumped over and collapsed onto his side. Andrea slammed on the gas pedal. She could not get to Dr. Conrad's office fast enough. By the time she finally skidded into the parking lot, she was in a complete panic. She didn't even bother to bring her son inside with her. She just got out of the car and sprinted into the doctor's office alone. A few moments later, Andrea rushed back outside with the doctor, and they went to her car and they found Tommy still laying in the back seat, completely still and silent. To Andrea's surprise, Dr. Conrad actually flung open the passenger side door and got inside. And then he told Andrea to get in and drive us to the Valley Children's Hospital. They had no time to waste. "20 minutes later, Andrea carried her semi-conscious son through the sliding doors of the hospital emergency room. Tommy's head lolled on her shoulder. Dr. Conrad ran beside her and yelled for the nurses to hook the 8-year-old up to an IV. A hospital staff member grabbed Tommy from Andrea's arms and placed him on a gurney. As nurses swarmed around them, Andrea felt her throat tighten with fear. The nurses pushed Tommy's gurney down the hallway, and Andrea chased after them, following them into a hospital room. Suddenly, she heard her son screaming, his face contorted in pain as the nurses worked to connect an IV. Andrea watched, helpless, while her son began to gag. He tried to lift his head, but he couldn't sit up, and so he vomited just onto the bed. Then, Tommy stopped moving altogether as tears filled his eyes. Andrea didn't understand how or why this was happening again. All she knew was that Tommy's symptoms were even worse than the first time. Andrea was terrified, but she had never been more thankful for Dr. Conrad. He told hospital staff to make sure they administer more atropine. Andrea stood next to her son's bed and just prayed the atropine would work the way it did the first time. Sure enough, a few hours later, Tommy was awake and his stomach pain had subsided. He asked for a glass of water, and when a nurse brought it in, he was able to reach out and grab it. Tommy wasn't confused anymore, he could move his limbs, so clearly the atropine had saved his life again. Andrea was obviously extremely relieved that her son had pulled through, but as she sat beside his hospital bed, she couldn't help but feel sick to her stomach. Clearly, something was poisoning her son, but if she didn't know what it was, how could she protect him? How could she make sure this did not happen a third time or more? Andrea noticed Dr. Conrad packing up his black bag to leave. Before he left, she pulled him aside and asked him for his help. She needed to know where this chemical poisoning was coming from. If it really was from a local farm like Dr. Conrad thought, then Andrea wanted to know exactly which one. That way, they could tell the farmer to please contain the poison and put a stop to this nightmare. When Dr. Conrad got home that evening, he sat down on his couch and made a list of every farm in the area. He picked up the phone off the side table and started calling them one by one. He asked if they'd recently sprayed any organic phosphate pesticides on their crops. They all told Dr. Conrad the same thing: no. There was not a single farmer in Fresno who had sprayed organic phosphates in the last few weeks. Dr. Conrad crossed the last farm off his list and hung up the phone. He was baffled. If the poison wasn't from a farm, where else could Tommy have come in contact with it? The doctor spent the entire evening pacing in his living room, racking his brain for another answer. He eventually went to bed, hoping he'd be able to come up with a plausible theory in the morning. But he woke up just as confused. As he crawled out of bed and started a pot of coffee, he had to admit that he needed help. Dr. Conrad sat back down on the couch and placed his coffee mug on the side table right next to the telephone. Then he picked up that telephone and he called the Fresno County Public Health Department and told them the whole story. There was a little boy suffering from repeated pesticide poisonings for no clear answer as to how he was being exposed to the deadly chemicals. The health department official asked some follow-up questions, like what Tommy had been doing before he became ill, and Dr. Conrad didn't really have all the answers, but he explained that the previous afternoon he had examined Tommy and given him a clean bill of health. Then, before the boy even made it back to his home, he became gravely ill again. His symptoms had appeared in less than an hour, and all Tommy had done was ride in the back seat of his mother's car. But that little detail of the boy riding in his mother's car caught the health department representative's attention. They assured Dr. Conrad they would get to the bottom of this, beginning with a thorough inspection of Andrea's vehicle. Later that morning, a man and a woman from the Fresno County Public Health Department knocked on Andrea's front door. Andrea shook their hands and welcomed them inside, but before she could say how happy she was to see them, they started asking questions. Did she keep any kind of chemical poisons in the house? Had she ever used ant or roach poison inside? Did she have a garden, and if so, did she treat her plants with pesticides? Andrea just shook her head. She didn't know of anything in her home or her car that could possibly be poisoning her son. She led the health department employees into her garage where her car was parked, and she watched them search every inch of her vehicle. After a few minutes, they came up empty-handed. Then they combed through the rest of her garage, but again, they didn't find anything. That only left one other option: the inside of Andrea's house. So Andrea opened the door for the investigators and told them to go ahead. As they searched, Andrea sat on the living room couch and called the hospital to check in on Tommy, who had been admitted to that hospital. The nurse would tell her that her son was stable and improving steadily. Andrea felt very relieved and placed the phone back on the hook. For the next hour, Andrea listened as the man and woman from the health department combed her entire house looking for the poison. But when they came into the living room where Andrea was, she asked them, "What have you found?" And they would tell her, nothing. There wasn't anything in her home, in her car, her garage, her garden, anywhere that could explain her son's poisoning. Andrea was totally crushed. But the two health department employees said they did have one more idea. They asked Andrea what her son had been wearing when he got sick. Andrea thought about it for a moment. The first time Tommy got sick, he had been wearing his favorite red and white striped t-shirt and a new pair of blue jeans and sneakers. The second time, he'd been wearing a different shirt, different shoes, but the same pair of blue jeans. They were actually in the laundry room in a pile of dirty clothes. She'd brought them home from the hospital, but she hadn't had a chance to wash them yet. When she said that, the investigators' eyes lit up. They told Andrea they needed those jeans right now. Those pants just might hold the answers to her son's illness. Later that afternoon, Dr. Conrad stood in a white-walled lab at the Fresno County Health Department laboratory wearing gloves and a face mask. Next to him, the health department investigators who had just searched Andrea's home gazed into a rectangular glass tank full of hundreds of buzzing mosquitoes. Dr. Conrad held Tommy's blue jeans in his gloved hand. When the investigators gave him the okay, he lifted the lid on the tank and quickly put the jeans inside and then shut the lid before any mosquitoes could escape. 15 minutes later, the buzzing had stopped. The lab was silent. Dr. Conrad looked over and saw the two investigators grinning. That's when he realized this was the breakthrough they needed. Every single mosquito inside of that glass tank was now dead, and Tommy's pants had killed them. It would turn out Tommy's own genes were the things that were poisoning him. They were loaded with toxic organophosphates. Now, Dr. Conrad had new questions. Where had these genes come from, and how did they become laced with pesticide? He used the health department laboratory's phone to call Andrea and explain the results of the experiment. He could tell by her voice that she was both very surprised and also very relieved, and luckily she was actually able to explain the genes. She said she'd bought those jeans about a month earlier in September. A trucking company was having a salvage sale for damaged goods and happened to have some nice jeans in Tommy's size. The pants were so cheap that Andrea actually bought 5 pairs of them, although Tommy had only worn 1 pair so far. Dr. Conrad told Andrea that it was highly likely that all of the jeans she had purchased were poisoned, so Tommy should obviously never wear them again. That's when Andrea pointed out that she actually did not buy every pair of jeans at the salvage sale. She said there had still been an entire stack of them after she had left with her 5 pairs. Dr. Conrad suddenly felt his heart start to race. This story wasn't over. There were more poisoned jeans out there right now, and so more children might get sick. Dr. Conrad hung up the phone and rushed back over to the investigators so they could try to figure out what to do next. Over the following weeks, Dr. Conrad and the Fresno County Public Health Department learned that the poisoned jeans had been shipped 8 months earlier, in early 1961. They were put in a truck alongside various chemicals, including a highly toxic organic phosphate pesticide called Fosdrin. During a trip from Fresno to Los Angeles, a container of Fosdrin had broken open, and over a gallon of the poison spilled onto a stack of jeans. Enough poison to kill 9,000 kids. When the truck finally got to Los Angeles, an employee brought the jeans to a store where they were supposed to be sold. But the manager of that store had noticed the pants were covered in oily-looking stains, so they sent them back to Fresno. The poisoned jeans were stored in a warehouse for the next 8 months until it was time for the trucking company's annual salvage sale. By then, the stains on the jeans had faded enough that customers didn't notice them. When Dr. Conrad and the health department contacted this trucking company, it was too late. The remaining pairs of the poisoned jeans had all been sold. The health department immediately went out and alerted the public to this crisis. And soon, they received 11 more pairs of jeans that had all been bought at the salvage sale. So that made 16 pairs, including the jeans Andrea had bought. In total, 1 other boy was hospitalized from these poisonous jeans, and 4 other children also fell ill. But luckily, like Tommy, all the children who were affected by these poisonous jeans made full recoveries. 1 month later, California lawmakers introduced a bill to ban the shipment of dangerous chemicals alongside food or clothing. Tighter legal restrictions and higher industry standards have since made accidents like the one that poisoned Tommy much less common. Before getting out of her car, 16-year-old high school junior Raina Ryson wrapped her boyfriend's navy blue Letterman jacket more tightly around her shoulders. Even if it hadn't been a chilly, cloudy day in the town of LaPorte, Indiana, Raina still would have worn the warm and oversized jacket, because this was 1993, and the fact that Matt Elser had given Raina this baseball-styled jacket with his name embroidered across the shoulder was a public declaration that the two of them were, once again, a couple, just as they had been, on and off, ever since Raina had been in the 7th grade. And even more important to Raina, wearing Matt's Letterman jacket gave her a feeling that most of her peers took for granted, a sense that she was safe and protected. Now, stepping out of her tan 1984 LTD Ford sedan into the high school parking lot, Raina gave herself just a few seconds to really savor the excitement and happiness she had been feeling all week long about the date that she and Matt had planned for tonight, Friday, March 26th. Turning to grab her backpack out of the car before shutting the driver's side door, Raina just felt thankful that after their latest breakup, she and Matt had both felt so lonely for one another, so incomplete without each other, that getting back together again was a mutual decision. As Raina looked around the busy parking lot and waved to a few of her friends and fellow members of the high school marching band, she thought about how right she and Matt were for each other.
Both of them made accomplishments like getting grades good enough to consistently have their names listed on the school's honor roll look easy. With all of its emblems, Matt's jacket alone represented many of his accomplishments, like being a member of the school's track and basketball teams. But it was the treble clef note stitched on the chest across the school logo that showed one of the passions they both shared, and that was music. Although not even Matt could compete with Raina in her ability to play not just first oboe in the school band, but also the flute and the clarinet. Not that Raina planned to pursue music once she graduated from high school. As she had told Matt, along with her family, Raina's real dream in life was to become a veterinarian, which is why her part-time job at the local animal clinic was far and away her favorite of the 3 part-time jobs that took up so much of Raina's after-school life. Usually, on a Friday evening, it would be that 4 to 6 p.m. shift at Pine Lake Animal Hospital that would be one of the high points of the start of the weekend. But today, Raina knew that while she fed the animals and cleaned cages that afternoon, what she'd really be thinking about was dinner later that evening with Matt. A moment later, as Raina walked into LaPorte High School and headed for her locker, she was immediately lost in the crowd of students who were all spinning their combination locks and exchanging greetings with each other before the first bell of the day called them all into class. With her thick mane of curly brown hair, her blue jeans and sneakers, her average height and her average weight, Raina looked like any other high school student from any other solid middle-class family in this typical Midwestern town of about 20,000 residents. But in Raina's class, looks were deceiving, because Raina was different from most of the other girls in that loud and busy hallway. Behind that smile and behind that talent for telling jokes that made her friends laugh out loud, Raina had recently survived a profound physical and emotional trauma. Beginning when she was just 11 years old, Raina had become the victim of a sexually abusive relationship. The perpetrator was her then 24-year-old brother-in-law, the husband of Raina's then 20-year-old sister, Lori, and the father of the couple's 2 small children, Raina's beloved niece and nephew. Raymond McCarty's abuse continued until Raina was 13 years old. That's when Raina became pregnant, and not even her abuser's threats that he would kill her if she told anyone about what he was doing to her could force her to keep this terrible secret. Raina finally broke down and told her mother and father what had been going on during those so-called family visits to her sister's home across town. Raina's father, Ben Ryson, had been the one to tell Raina's sister, Lori, what had happened. Confronted by Ben, Raymond McCarty admitted that he had been having sex with Raina and agreed to turn himself into police. And in 1991, 2 years earlier, Raymond was convicted of a Class D felony for child molesting. A felony is the legal definition for a serious crime. Punishment can range from 1 year in prison to death. Class D is the least serious felony, a category that includes cruelty to animals, defacing a firearm, and aggravated assault. And instead of being ordered to serve time in prison, Raymond was given 2 years probation. Raymond's wife, Lori, stayed with Raymond, and Raina's parents also maintained ties with Raymond. In order to keep Raina safe, the family decided they would set their own internal restrictions to keep Raymond away from Raina. Now, 3 years after this traumatic experience, Raina's boyfriend, Matt, was one of just a few people outside the Ryson family who knew the details of Raina's abuse. Along with Matt in this small circle, there was also Raina's earlier boyfriend, a boy named Jason Tibbs, who Raina had, quote, dated, end quote, for about 6 months when both she and Jason were in the 6th grade. Given how young both Raina and Jason were, Raina's parents were relieved when the youngsters broke up and went back to just being very good friends. They were also pleased when Raina eventually settled her affections on Matt, who was just the kind of clean-cut, studious, and straight-arrow teenager that they felt would treat Raina well. Still, Raina had felt very relieved to be able to confide in both her friends, Jason as well as Matt, about a recent and unwelcome development in her life. Just several weeks earlier, Raymond McCarty had finished his probation sentence, which meant that as far as the courts were concerned, he'd served his time for having sexually abused Raina, and now he was free. And now that Raymond was free of the restrictions that the courts had placed on his behavior, it was up to the Ryson family to monitor Raymond's relationship and behavior towards Raina. Given how emotionally loaded this topic was for Raina's sister Lori and for Raina's parents, it was easier for Raina to tell Jason and Matt, rather than her own family, that it seemed to her that since Raymond's release from probation, her brother-in-law was once again making unwanted advances towards Raina. Standing in front of her school locker, Raina again pulled Matt's jacket close around her and reminded herself that she was strong and that she was loved. Even when Matt had asked for that recent break in their relationship, Raina had not fallen apart. She had said yes, and she had kept herself busy with her job tutoring a couple of middle school students, working at a local takeout restaurant, and best of all, working at the Pine Lake Animal Hospital. Still, Raina had been incredibly happy when she and Matt had both decided to get back together again. Now, tucking her school books under her arm, Raina looked down at her watch. She was so excited about this evening's special dinner with Matt that she was literally counting down the hours. At 6 p.m. sharp that Friday night, Raina stepped out of the Pine Lake Animal Hospital. In exactly 1 hour, Matt was supposed to pick her up at her house on 202 A Street, just 1.5 miles south of the animal clinic. Raina had already made a quick trip to the Ryson's neat 2-story home in the shady neighborhood where Raina lived with her parents and her younger sister Wendy. She'd stopped there right after school, just long enough to grab a snack, change into her work jeans and sweatshirt, drop off her book bag, and say goodbye to her younger sister Wendy, who was headed out the door to go see a movie with some friends. Raina hadn't needed to tell her sister or parents how quickly she planned to get back to the house after her 4 to 6 p.m. shift that evening. Everyone already knew how much Raina and Matt were looking forward to their date that night, and how Raina would want to spend as much time as she could between 6 and 7 picking out what to wear and making sure she looked her best for when Matt arrived. But now, as Raina was getting ready to close up the animal clinic for the evening, she heard the door to the waiting room open, and right away, Raina's heart sank. Tightening her hands around the handle of the broom she was holding, Raina hoped it was not the same person who had paid her an unexpected visit earlier in the afternoon. Matt was too excited about the evening he had planned for Raina to wait until 7 p.m. Arriving early at the Ryson house at 202 A Street, he parked his car by the curb, looking up first at the lighted front porch, then down at his watch. But when 7 p.m. came and went, and Raina still had not opened her front door, Matt decided to drive to the Pine Lake Animal Hospital, thinking that maybe Raina had had to work late that evening. But when Matt arrived at the square 1-story clinic 5 minutes later, there was no sign of Raina, and no sign of her tan Ford LTD car. After making the loop again, from the clinic to Raina's house, and then back to the clinic, Matt drove back to 202 A Street, parked his car at the curb, walked up to the Ryson's front door, and knocked. A moment later, Raina's dad, Ben, was telling Matt that Raina still had not arrived home from work. When Ben invited Matt to come inside and wait for Raina there, Matt explained that Raina was not at the animal clinic either. In that moment, both Matt and Ben Ryson knew something had to be wrong. For the past week, all Raina had talked about was this date with Matt. If she hadn't been delayed by a work emergency, there was just no way Raina would have stood Matt up. And there was also no way that Raina would just hop into her car and drive off without a word to Matt or to her family. By 10:30 p.m. that night, Ben and his wife Karen Ryson arrived at the LaPorte police station to report their 16-year-old daughter missing. After being informed that police would not start searching for Raina until she had been missing for 24 hours, the Rysons returned home, and frustrated by the response they had just gotten from police, the Rysons contacted the LaPorte High School music director, and together, the 3 adults launched their own search. 12 hours later, on the morning of Saturday, March 27th, the town was plastered with flyers and posters showing pictures of Raina and letting people know that she was last seen at the animal clinic the night before. Raina was still missing, but now there were so many people, her family, her friends, her fellow band members, her neighbors, out looking for her that local police realized they could not just stand on the sidelines. So, by mid-morning, well before that 24-hour mark had passed, police issued their own call for information and tips about the missing 16-year-old, and by Saturday afternoon, there were state police helicopters flying low over LaPorte County, and police from other nearby areas had also joined the search. Almost immediately, the public appeal for information resulted in what police and the family believed might be an important lead. More than one witness had stepped forward to say they had seen 2 cars in the parking lot at the animal clinic around 6 p.m. on Friday night. In addition to Raina's car, there was another sedan, this one with 2 men inside and a teenage girl standing outside the car who appeared to be arguing with the person in the passenger seat. These bystanders had chalked up the scene to a possible teenage lover's quarrel until they saw the flyers that featured a missing teenage girl who fit the description of the girl they'd observed in the parking lot. Raina's father, Ben, had already given police his account of Raina's disappearance and mentioned Matt's presence at the Ryson family home the night Ben first asked police for their help. But in light of this tip that suggested Raina's disappearance might be connected to an argument or even a kidnapping that could involve more than one suspect who might have had contact with Raina just before she went missing, investigators got busy with formal interviews of Raina's family and friends. Detectives were especially interested in talking to Raina's boyfriend, Matt, asking him to give a more detailed account of exactly what he had been doing and where he was the night that Raina disappeared. But Matt's story was the same one Ben and Matt had both told on the night of Friday, March 26th. He arrived at Raina's house before 7 p.m. for their date. When Raina didn't show up, he made a few trips out to the animal hospital where he saw no sign of Raina or her car before he entered the Ryson house at about 7:15 to wait there with Raina's parents and sister for Raina to come home. But even before police had a chance to confirm Matt's story and his alibi, there was yet another very big development in what had become an official missing persons investigation. On Sunday morning, March 28th, so about 30 hours after Raina's disappearance, police reported finding Raina's car parked alongside a county road about 9 miles from her home. The hood was propped open, like the driver had been having car troubles, but police quickly determined that the scene had only been staged to appear that way. Not only did police find Raina's purse and car keys left inside of the 1984 tan Ford sedan, but when police turned on the engine, the car worked just fine. Then, even as crime scene techs were called to the scene to look for fingerprints and other potential evidence to explain what had happened, police found a ring, too large to fit Raina, in the glove compartment of the car. 7 days after Raina's disappearance, inquiries among Raina's friends about who the ring might belong to led police to Raina's former boyfriend and childhood friend, Jason Tibbs, one of the many people who had participated in the ongoing search for Raina. Jason was surprised but not worried when police showed him the ring they had found. He identified it right away as his ring and explained that he must have stowed it inside of the glove compartment of Raina's car when he had taken it off so he could fit his hand inside of a tight space while repairing Raina's car radio a few months ago. Jason also shrugged off Matt's suggestion to police that Jason was still romantically interested in Raina. Jason readily admitted to investigators that yes, he and Raina had dated briefly back in middle school before Raina and Matt had become a couple. But since then, Jason and Raina had just been friends, an account that was later confirmed by Raina's father, Ben, who remembered that Raina had asked Jason if he could help her with some small car repairs. Like Matt, Jason also had an alibi for the Friday night that Raina went missing. He'd spent that evening playing a popular game of car hide-and-seek with his friends. Called fox hunting, the game involved a driver parking their car somewhere in town, and then, using citizen band radios called CBs, the driver would give out clues that would eventually lead a winner to find the car and driver. And sure enough, police confirmed that Jason had given clues on and off throughout that evening to his fellow players via the citizen band radio. It wasn't until several days later that police made the discovery that would change the direction of the investigation into Raina's disappearance. That's when police discovered the Letterman jacket belonging to Matt Elser, the jacket that Raina wore or took with her everywhere in a wooded area that police had already searched several times since Raina's disappearance. Hanging 3 feet above the ground in the branches of a tree, located in a wooded area 6 miles south of where Raina's car had been found, the sudden appearance of the jacket confirmed the growing suspicion that there was nothing voluntary about Raina's disappearance, and that someone had realized after Raina went missing that they had to get rid of a piece of important evidence that might link them to the missing teenager. Right away, police re-interviewed the owner of the jacket, Matt, but again, Matt's story was exactly the same, and everyone who knew Raina confirmed that whether Matt was with Raina or not, Raina was always wearing or carrying Matt's Letterman jacket with her. But it wouldn't be until 24 days later, on April 27, 1993, that the Ryson family received the phone call that they, and the rest of the close-knit town of LaPorte, had quietly been dreading. That was when a teenage daughter, whose dad was fishing at a county pond just 30 feet from a nearby road and 7 miles from the Pine Lake Animal Hospital, discovered the submerged and badly decomposed body of a white female wearing clothes and jewelry that matched the physical description of Raina Ryson. One day later, an autopsy by the county coroner would confirm Raina's identity. The 3.5-hour examination would also reveal that the cause of Raina's death was strangulation. And suddenly, what had been a missing persons investigation was now officially a homicide investigation. With the recovery of their 16-year-old daughter's body, along with the terrible knowledge that she had been murdered, the Ryson family went from praying for Raina's safe return to praying that her killer would be brought to justice. And for the first time since Friday, March 26th, the Ryson family turned off their front and back porch lights that they had left on for 33 days, hoping to welcome home their beloved middle daughter. 3 days later, on May 1st, hundreds of people would attend the funeral service for one of LaPorte High School's most gifted musicians, and Raina, 1 week shy of her 17th birthday, would be buried by her family in a white casket trimmed with pink and covered with a blanket of flowers. Meanwhile, information that had been reported in the newspaper just days after Raina's disappearance, back when she was still considered missing and not murdered, now took on new significance and pointed investigators towards a new suspect, Raina's brother-in-law, Raymond McCarty. Looking through old police reports, investigators had found the statement Raina had made back in 1991 that contained graphic details of the sexual abuse that Raina had suffered at the hands of her brother-in-law. And during yet another round of interviews with both Matt and Jason, both boys would tell police that since Raymond had completed his probationary sentence several weeks before Raina's disappearance, Raina had mentioned that Raymond, once again, seemed to be making sexual overtures. Now, with both Matt and Jason's alibis still holding up, investigators wondered if maybe Raymond might have killed Raina out of anger that she had reported the abuse that led to his conviction 2 years earlier, or that she had rejected and maybe threatened to go public with any new advances he may have made. Police suspicions were heightened when they discovered that Raina had had an argument with her sister, Lori, Raymond's wife, the week before Raina disappeared. And during that argument, Lori accused Raina of leading Raymond on. On April 30th, one day before Raina's funeral, and again on June 13th, police impounded both vehicles belonging to Raymond and Lori McCarty to search for any evidence that might link Raina's sister or brother-in-law to Raina's murder. Meanwhile, Raymond's account of where he was on the evening that Raina disappeared would keep changing. At the time of Raina's disappearance, Raymond told police he was out of the area at a friend's farm. But later, Raymond would tell police that he had given a female hitchhiker a ride that evening. Later still, Raymond would tell police that on the evening of Raina's disappearance, he was actually looking at a house for sale that was located just a few blocks from the Pine Lake Animal Hospital. 17 months later, police formally identified Lori and Raymond as suspects in Raina's homicide. But before detectives could put together a case against these two suspects, police received a shocking tip that looked like it would send the homicide investigation in a completely different direction. In December of 1994, about 3 months after Lori and Raymond were named as suspects, LaPorte law enforcement got a call from police in Illinois who had arrested a man on kidnapping charges. Larry Hall, who would later become a notorious suspected serial killer, claimed that he had raped and murdered several young women, including Raina Ryson. Inside the man's van, police found newspaper articles about Raina's disappearance and murder, along with a bottle of birth control pills that had a crudely printed label on it with Raina's name. But it wouldn't take long for Larry Hall to recant that confession, and in the meantime, police had determined that the label on the pill bottle was a fake and that the suspect could not have killed Raina because he had been in Kentucky at the time of Raina's disappearance. 3.5 years later, with no other active leads, police had once again circled back to Raymond McCarty as their primary suspect. And in May of 1998, just over 5 years after Raina's disappearance and murder, police arrested Raymond and charged him with Raina's murder and locked him up in LaPorte County Jail pending a trial. But 15 months later, prosecutors decided that the evidence they had collected against Raymond was not strong enough to support a charge of murder. That evidence, found inside Raymond's vehicle and inside the McCarty house, consisted of several handguns, a stun gun, and bloodstains in his car that later turned out to belong to a deer that Ray had shot while he was out hunting. So, in August of 1999, 6 years and 4 months after Raina was murdered, Raymond McCarty was released from jail, and the investigation into Raina's death hit what looked like its final dead end. Once every year, a $200 scholarship in Raina's memory was still awarded to a member of the LaPorte High School band. No one had ever claimed the $36,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Raina's killer. And no one inside the community had come forward with any new revelation about what might have happened to Raina. And over the years, while the town of LaPorte never forgot that there might still be a killer in their midst, people's fear that the killer might strike again slowly faded into the distant past. It wasn't until the early summer of 2013, more than 20 years after Raina Ryson was murdered, that police finally got the break in this case that they had been looking for. That's when detectives were able to act on a tip they had actually gotten 5 years earlier and do a formal interview with an eyewitness to Raina's murder. In exchange for a promise that they would not face any criminal charges, this eyewitness walked investigators through everything that happened on the night of March 26th, when 16-year-old Raina stepped out of the Pine Lake Animal Clinic and saw an Oldsmobile Buick parked in the lot outside the clinic door. The story police heard would change every single thing they thought they knew about Raina's murder. Based on that eyewitness account, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on the night that Raina Ryson disappeared. As Raina's killer slipped into the front passenger seat of the Oldsmobile Buick, they looked down at their watch and gave a nod of satisfaction. It was a foggy Friday night in LaPorte, Indiana, and the killer intended to kick off the weekend with a little visit to the Pine Lake Animal Hospital. Turning to the driver, who had borrowed this car from a friend, the killer gestured to the road ahead. Time to get going. A few minutes later, the driver and the killer had arrived at their destination. The killer looked first at the clock on the dashboard and then around the animal clinic parking lot to make sure it was empty, except for Raina's tan LTD Ford. Then the killer smiled. Perfect. There was still plenty of time before the clinic closed for the killer to get inside. And from the empty lot, the killer assumed that no one other than Raina was inside. Opening the passenger side door, the killer got out of the car and told the driver to wait while the killer went into the one-story square building located at 330 Pine Lake Avenue. Inside the clinic, Raina was doing what she always did at the end of her shift, sweeping the floor and tidying up. But hearing the front door into the clinic open, Raina suddenly froze. She'd already had one unexpected visitor that afternoon, and she hoped that whoever had just walked in this close to closing time was just there for business. But as soon as Raina saw who this new visitor was, her shoulders relaxed. Letting out a breath that she hadn't even realized she'd been holding, Raina pushed her hair back from her face as she stopped to lean on the handle of the broom. But after just a short conversation with her visitor, Raina's sense of relief had been replaced by frustration and annoyance. Having this discussion was not how Raina had planned to spend even a minute of her evening. It was now 6 p.m. and time to close the clinic, and all Raina wanted to do was head home so she could get ready for her date with Matt. But when Raina and her visitor walked out the front door together a few minutes later, the two of them had already started to argue. And when Raina had turned around after locking the front door of the clinic, she saw that parked right there in front of her in the lot was a car, engine running, and a driver in the front seat. By the time Raina and her killer had reached the Oldsmobile Buick, it was clear to Raina that her visitor was not going to be satisfied until the two of them had finished this conversation once and for all. So when Raina's killer gestured toward the car and asked Raina to just get in so they could drive around and talk, Raina looked down at her watch. She had a few minutes to spare, and better to just get this conversation over with here and now. So Raina agreed to the plan, on the condition that it really would be a short drive, because she had a date at 7 p.m. that evening that she was not about to miss. Just a moment later, Raina, wearing the Letterman jacket that she would later take off inside the car, had slipped into the back seat with her visitor. As soon as the driver heard the back door of the car shut, they checked the side and rear view mirror, put the car into gear, and pulled away from the clinic, heading east on Pine Lake Avenue. By the time the car had turned onto a heavily wooded section of North Vale Road, about 4 miles from the animal clinic, one or both of the passengers demanded that the driver stop the car. The argument in the back seat had gotten so loud that the driver was alarmed and immediately pulled over and turned off the engine. Looking up at the rearview mirror, the driver saw both passengers jump out of the car, then come into view again as they faced off on the deserted road, standing just behind the car's rear bumper. Their fight now was physical, and Raina was using every ounce of strength to protect herself. But a second later, the driver saw Raina's killer pull back their arm and deliver a savage punch directly into Raina's face. Scrambling out of the front seat, the driver made it around the side of the car just in time to see that Raina lay on the ground and that her attacker had straddled her body and wrapped their hands around Raina's neck. As the driver stood there, frozen, Raina's attacker leaned hard into Raina's neck, cutting off her supply of oxygen and literally squeezing the life out of her. Afterward, there was a moment of stunned silence, and then, standing up slowly and still breathing hard, Raina's killer gestured for the driver to open the trunk of the car. Together, the killer and the driver lifted Raina's body up off the road and dumped her into the trunk. Slamming the lid of the trunk shut, the driver and killer got back into the car and headed for the barn located a few miles away that belonged to the family of the person who owned the Oldsmobile Buick. Once inside the big open space of the pole barn, neither the killer nor the driver looked up at the rafters and saw 14-year-old Ricky Hammonds, the brother of the car's owner, sitting up in the loft getting high on a joint of marijuana. But that 14-year-old boy saw them, and when the two people below him popped open the trunk of the car and stared down at the body of a teenage girl with brown curly hair, dressed in blue jeans and sneakers, Ricky saw that too. And later that weekend, when 14-year-old Ricky Hammonds heard about the missing girl from LaPorte High School and saw her picture in the papers and on the news, he knew that the name of the girl in the trunk of the family's Oldsmobile Buick was Raina Ryson. But on that cool Friday evening, all Ricky knew was that he better stay really, really quiet, because people who drove around with a dead body in their car were dangerous. Ricky was relieved when the car's driver and passenger finally stopped arguing, hopped back in the Buick, turned on the engine, and then reversed out of the barn. But even after the sound of the car tires rolling across gravel had faded, Ricky stayed where he was, holding the smoke from the joint inside his lungs. If he told anyone about what he had seen, maybe those two people would come back and kill him too. Or maybe he'd get in trouble for smoking marijuana. Either way, the 14-year-old boy decided not to say anything at all. Breathing the smoke out through his nose, he tried to enjoy the last few puffs on his joint, but it wasn't any use. The buzz he'd been feeling before the car had rolled into the pole barn was as dead as the girl with the white face, all the color drained right out of her. Meanwhile, the Buick's driver had dropped Raina's killer back off at the Pine Lake Animal Hospital to pick up Raina's tan Ford sedan. Holding Raina's purse and car keys, the killer hopped behind the wheel of Raina's car, started up the engine, and then, one behind the other, the cars headed in the direction of a small county pond about 7 miles away. Once they were close enough to their destination that they could see the water about 30 feet from the road, the cars pulled to a stop. A few minutes later, the driver of the Buick, along with Raina's killer, had dragged Raina's body out of the trunk. After dumping Raina face down in the weeds and muck at the edge of the pond, the driver and killer grabbed 2 nearby logs and pulled them on top of Raina's body until she was fully submerged. The driver and killer wiped off their hands and got back into their cars. A few minutes later, they came to a stop along County Road 200E, 5 miles northwest of LaPorte. After parking Raina's car on the shoulder of the road, Raina's killer propped open the hood so the car looked disabled and abandoned. Then, hopping back into the passenger seat of the Oldsmobile Buick, the killer rolled the car window partway down, leaned back, and sucked in big mouthfuls of the chill night air. Pulling away from the side of the road, the driver turned the car south. A few minutes later, the driver of the car dropped the killer off at the killer's house and then returned the car he had been driving that night to the pole barn. Even if the driver of the car had known to look, by then, 14-year-old Ricky Hammonds was nowhere in sight. Later that same night, the killer would return to the pole barn to pick up the Letterman jacket that Raina had left in the back seat of the Buick. And a day or two later, Raina's killer would drive to the same secluded area where the killer had strangled Raina, and the killer would throw the jacket as far as they could into the woods, hoping that if the jacket was ever found, it would lead police to Raina's boyfriend, Matt Elser. 15 years later, in 2008, Ricky Hammonds decided it was time to tell police what he saw in the pole barn the night that Raina Ryson was murdered, and give the police the names of the 2 people he believed killed her. By then, Ricky's own life had gone off the rails, and the now 29-year-old Ricky was serving a 44-year-long prison sentence for a murder that he had committed 10 years earlier. But Ricky wasn't looking for any personal benefit in exchange for talking with state police. According to Ricky, now that he had nieces of his own, he just wanted the Ryson family to know what happened to their 16-year-old daughter. But even though Ricky's account of what he saw that night in the barn seemed very credible, it would take another 5 years before Indiana state prosecutors would offer immunity to the driver of the Oldsmobile Buick in exchange for testifying against Raina's killer. That driver was a man named Eric Freeman, who, at the time of Raina's death, was the boyfriend of the car's owner, Ricky's older sister. And in June of 2013, after more than 20 years of chasing hundreds of dead ends, investigators sat down with Eric Freeman and finally confirmed the identity of Raina's killer, her one-time boyfriend in middle school and one of the few people Raina had entrusted with her secrets and her friendship, Jason Tibbs, who was 16 years old at the time of her murder. It would turn out, starting back in the 6th grade, Jason had developed such strong feelings for Raina that even after their 6-month preteen romance ended, Jason had never given up on, quote, getting Raina back, end quote. Instead, in the years after their breakup, Jason had always kept in touch with Raina. He sent her love letters that police and Raina's family had found among Raina's belongings. Jason helped Raina with small car repairs, and Jason was outraged by the abuse that Raina had suffered at the hands of her brother-in-law, Raymond. And according to Jason's friend, Eric Freeman, on March 26, 1993, Jason had asked Eric to drive him to Pine Lake Animal Hospital, where Raina worked, so when Raina got off her shift at 6 p.m., Jason could talk with her again about the 2 of them maybe getting back together. But even before Raina agreed to get into the car with Jason and Eric told investigators that it was clear from Raina and Jason's argument that Raina, quote, just didn't want to be with Jason Tibbs, end quote. Freeman told police that during that drive, the couple's argument got so loud that Eric told them he wanted to leave, and Eric felt relieved when they told him to stop, and then both Raina and Jason got out of the car, but Eric said he never suspected that Jason was about to kill Raina. Afterward, when Eric and Jason arrived at the pole barn that belonged to the family of Eric's girlfriend, neither teenager noticed 14-year-old Ricky Hammonds up in the rafters smoking a joint. But when Eric stood next to Jason, looking down at Raina's body in the open trunk of the Buick, and asked Jason why he'd killed her, both Eric and Ricky heard and remembered Jason's answer. Quote, "If I can't have her, nobody can," end quote. As for Jason's alibi, that he was out fox hunting in his car with friends, police would discover that while players may have heard Jason's voice on their CB radios that night, no one actually saw him and could confirm his physical whereabouts. As for Raina's earlier visitor at the animal hospital on the afternoon of March 26th, that was her brother-in-law, Raymond McCarty. It was Raymond's sexual abuse of Raina, coupled with his eventual admission that on the afternoon Raina had disappeared, he had gone from looking at that house for sale directly to the animal clinic to visit Raina, that would make Raymond the prime suspect in Raina's murder and help lead to his wrongful arrest back in 1998. On August 23, 2013, 20 years and 5 months after Raina Ryson was strangled to death, 37-year-old Jason Tibbs, who was married with children and still living in LaPorte County, Indiana, was arrested and charged with Raina Ryson's murder. On November 7, 2014, Jason was found guilty. 1 month later, Jason Tibbs was sentenced to the state minimum for a murder committed in 1993, 40 years in prison, but with 20 years of that sentence already served. Raina's brother-in-law, Raymond McCarty, would die in February 2018 at the age of 52 from a self-inflicted wound. At the time of his death, Raymond McCarty was in jail, having been arrested 3 days earlier on a charge of battery resulting in serious bodily injury. The inscription on Raina Ryson's headstone reads, quote, "She now plays a flute of silver and an oboe of gold," end quote.
At 6:30 p.m. on July 29, 2023, a 15-year-old girl named Talia Davila Diaz stood right outside her back door of her house, staring out at the thick, dense, shadowy rainforest that was her backyard. Talia lived in a tiny, isolated village in Peru that was literally in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. So as she was looking out, she would have seen these huge tropical trees and heard the sound of howler monkeys and exotic birds and animals moving all about, and the air would have been really thick and humid. But she wasn't thinking about any of that. Instead, she was focused on this grapefruit tree that was only a few yards away from her house. She wanted to go get a grapefruit and bring it inside and make juice for her family. However, Talia was scared. And she was scared for 2 reasons. The first reason was this was the Amazon, an inherently dangerous place, especially at night. There were loads of predators out there, like snakes and jaguars. But the other reason she was scared was that she was worried there could actually be something worse out in the rainforest, worse than any predators she was used to. And that was because over the last couple of weeks, people in Talia's village had been claiming they were seeing these shadowy figures lurking in the tree line with these bright green eyes that would occasionally seem like they were hunting the people of the village. Like anytime they went out, it was like these figures were kind of lurking off in the distance, but nobody knew what they were. The rumor around the village was that these shadowy figures were actually pelikaras, which translates literally to face peelers. People in Talia's village believed that pelikaras were foreigners who would kidnap locals and cut their throats and peel the skin of their face off and then sell their body fat on the black market. And the locals were so freaked out that pelikaras could be around that they began performing nightly patrols to keep the villagers safe. So Talia, again, was very scared to even leave her house at this point, but she was also trying to be reasonable. She'd gone out and gotten a grapefruit many times in the past. This was not some new behavior, so she's looking out and she sees the grapefruit tree and she knows there's a nightly patrol out right now, and I only have to go a few yards and get the fruit and get right back in the house. Like, how big of a deal could this possibly be? And so after taking one more look around and not seeing anybody or hearing anything that was out of place, she took a breath and then rushed out to the tree. She grabbed a grapefruit, and as she was turning around, she froze because her worst nightmare had just been realized. Now, standing between her and her back door were these 2 hulking dark figures. And one of them was like so tall, it was practically the size of a tree. And they both had these piercing, glowing green eyes. And they were looking right at Talia. And Talia was so instantaneously petrified that all she could do was just stand there and stare back into their green eyes. And as she did, she began to notice that their faces were grotesquely elongated, almost like they had masks on. And then before Talia could do anything, the really tall one began sort of gliding towards her. Not stepping towards her, but literally almost hovering off the ground towards Talia. And then suddenly, Talia was being grabbed and thrown to the ground. And the instant Talia hit the ground, these two figures descended on her and pinned her there. And then one of them reached down and pressed their hand over her mouth and her nose, and she couldn't breathe. And then she sees the other one is holding what looked like a box cutter or a knife, and they put it right up to her neck. And suddenly it's like Talia understands these are Pelikaras. They're gonna slit her throat. They're gonna kill her. And so she has this sudden burst of energy and she manages to push them off of her. And when she did, their hand came off her mouth and she screamed out for help. And she heard somewhere in the village voices yelling back to her. And then she heard footsteps and she knew it was the night patrol coming to save her. And so at this point, the figures released Talia and she scrambled to her feet and immediately ran towards her house right as the night patrol came bounding into her yard, and one of the men had a gun and he raised it and began shooting in the direction of the figures. And Talia, she's totally panicked and she turns around and she looks at her attackers. And she's expecting them to, be fleeing into the rainforest. But instead, these dark figures, they were like levitating in the sky and they were looking down at Talia and the night patrol with their glowing green eyes as they literally began to levitate into the sky. And the whole time, the night patrol is firing repeatedly at these things and they just drifted off into the night and disappeared. Talia ultimately would not suffer any physical injuries from this encounter, but mentally, she was a wreck. And frankly, so was the rest of the people in her village, especially those who were on the night patrol and with Talia witnessed these figures with green eyes flying away into the sky. I mean, the fear in this village following this encounter was through the roof. And in fact, ultimately, the Peruvian government would get involved after this encounter and they would investigate to try to figure out, what happened to Talia. And they would ultimately conclude that there was an illegal mining operation happening somewhere in the rainforest, and some of these miners, in an effort to scare people away from coming anywhere near their operation, they got their hands on jetpacks, wore armor and masks, and then went into villages like Talia's and basically pretended to be aliens and then did, fly off on their jetpacks. That is the official story as of right now. However, people like Talia and the other people in her village and many other people who live in the Amazon rainforest who have come in contact with these figures with green eyes, they say those are no miners. Those are either Pelikaras or they are creatures from another world. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Window. On March 4th, 1946, nearly every resident of a rural Brazilian town called Araçariguama packed up a few days' worth of food and drink and headed south to the nearest big city to celebrate the Festival of Carnaval. This festival is an opportunity for folks to cut loose and eat good food right before most of them go into a religious fasting period. One resident who opted not to join the fun at this festival was a 44-year-old man named Joau Prestige Filho. Joau was a farmer, he had 5 kids, he was a very quiet guy, and he did not enjoy things like the Festival for Carnaval. The crowds and the noise made him anxious, and he really hated dancing, which there was a lot of at these festivals. Instead, Joau would rather spend his spare time out in nature. And so, when Joau's friends and family and everybody else disappeared to head off to this festival, Joau did just that. He and his best friend packed up Joau's horse and cart, and they traveled across the dirt roads through the woods to the nearby Tietê River, where they spent the day fishing for catfish. And as Joau stood on the rocks casting out his line, he listened to the birds sing and the parrots swooping by. It was beautiful and sunny out. I mean, this was a perfect day for Joau. As sunset drew near, though, both Joau and his best friend knew that while the rainforest they were in was beautiful during the day, at night it could become quite hazardous with the animals that come out at night, and so they knew they needed to leave. And so they packed up all the fish they caught back into Joau's cart, and then the two of them hopped onto the cart and began making the journey back towards the town of Araçariguama. When the pair got to a split in the road, Joau's best friend hopped off the cart and walked on foot down one path because his house was actually just outside of the town,
and Joau, still in his cart with his horse, said bye to his friend and went the other direction. Now, by this point, the sun had completely set, and so it was totally dark out as Joau is going down this dirt road in the final stretch towards his town. At this time, in 1946, Araçariguama was a beautiful place, but by no means a modern place. They had no running water, no electricity, there was no sewage, no paved roads, no access to main roads, and nobody had a telephone. It was basically like this little patch of civilization with about 100 people living there. There was a church in the middle of the town and a couple of small huts that kind of sat around it. And Joau and his family lived in one of those huts. Joau usually loved walking along or traveling along this particular stretch of dirt road, especially at night, like he was doing right now. He really enjoyed looking up at the stars and listening to the animals off in the forest that he couldn't see. But this night, Joau just had a bad feeling as he was making this final approach towards his town. Now remember, there's almost no one in the town. They're all at this festival, so it's kind of like a ghost town in the middle of a forest. But Joau, as he's going down this dirt road and he can see the church up ahead, he's a couple 100 feet away, he began getting this very unnerving sense that he was being watched. And so Joau, as he's in his cart, began looking into the trees and all around him, wondering if maybe an animal or a person was nearby, but there was no one. Finally, Joau actually reached the church and he could see his little house, and he could also see that his wife, who was at the festival, had opened up one of the windows just slightly so he could open it up the rest of the way and crawl into the house when he was back from fishing, because she had locked the doors when she left. And so by this point, Joau was trying to be very calm and collected despite this stress of feeling like he's being watched. But when he saw that window and he saw how close he was to his house, he basically just had the horse sprint the rest of the way to his home. He just wanted to get off the streets. And so finally, Joau, he reaches his house, he crawls in through the window, he shuts it behind him, and immediately Joau expected to feel totally relieved that he was now behind locked and closed doors and windows. He was safe. But despite being inside of his home, he still had this sense that there was someone or something around him that was watching him. Joau, like many other residents of this village, was fairly superstitious. There was an old abandoned mine that was near the town, and Joau and his peers had grown up hearing stories about some monster that lived in the mine that would come out at night and roam the forest. And older people in this village would talk about this ancient serpent called Boitata that would come out at night and it would appear in a burst of fire. And so Joau, he's thinking about the mine and these demons and ghosts that roam in the forest, and he's all alone because everyone's at this festival and he doesn't feel safe inside of his house, and so he's really starting to panic. And it's at this moment that he suddenly feels this sense that whatever or whoever has been watching him is right out his window to his left. And so Joau, as he's turning to look out the window, he's anticipating seeing a person out there, or maybe a jaguar or some other animal that's followed him from the rainforest. But when Joau turns and looks out the window into the dark night, what he sees right outside of his property was so terrifying that for a second Joau couldn't even breathe. And he just stood there staring at this thing, and then he tried to put his hands up to protect himself, but it was already too late. Minutes later, Joau would come stumbling out of his front door, out into the dark night. He's got a big blanket wrapped around him, and he was just screaming incoherently. And as he screamed all this nonsense, he began running in this kind of zigzag pattern with no clear destination in mind. It was just like this mindless running all through the village. And as he's running, he's got no shoes on, and he's stepping on sharp rocks and glass and trash. He's cutting his feet up horribly, but he doesn't seem to even notice. And so as he's doing this, he's causing this huge scene, but everybody's gone. It's a ghost town. It's just him in this abandoned village in the middle of a rainforest in Brazil. But eventually, Joau kind of calmed himself down and ran to his sister's house, Marie, because he noticed there was a lamp on inside of her house, and he was hoping that maybe she too had stayed back from the festival. And it would turn out Marie had not gone to the festival. She too did not really like big gatherings like that. And so she was home.
And so Marie was in her kitchen when she began hearing outside this horrible screaming sound, almost guttural sounds coming from someone or some animal out there. And then before she could even figure out what it was, she heard this loud thud against her door. Marie was terrified and she ran to her front window to look out and see what it was that had just collided with her door. And what she saw made no sense. It was her brother, Joau, but he was wrapped in that big blanket and his feet were all bloody and he was screaming at the top of his lungs, but he wasn't saying anything. He was just kind of babbling. And so Marie was about to run over and open the door for her brother. But right before she did, as she's looking out the window, Joau turned and looked at her, and when he did, she screamed because his eyes looked so alien. They were wide and totally unfocused, and she thought, that can't be my brother. What's wrong with him? But she would go over and open the door because after all, it is her brother. And so she opens the door, Joau kind of falls into the room and began writhing around on the ground, continuing this scream he was emitting that didn't even seem human. And the whole time, Marie is trying to ask him, what's wrong? What's going on here? She's scanning him, and besides the cuts all over his feet, he didn't appear to have other injuries. And so eventually, Marie just knelt down and she was about to grab Joau and try to kind of stop him from moving around, to just look at him and try to have a conversation with him. But before she grabbed him, Joau rolled over and his lips opened up, exposing his teeth. And he kind of grimaced at her with those wild, unfocused eyes. And again, Marie just kind of backed up in horror. Who is this? What's happened to my brother? And as Marie stood up to get away from Joau, Joau, still with that sickening grin with his teeth exposed, had this kind of low hiss come out of his mouth. And so Marie, thinking he was trying to talk, she leaned in, and through this hiss, she heard him repeating, "It burns, it burns." And so Marie, thinking her brother must have been burned, instinctively began removing the blanket and pulling his clothes off to find the source of this burn on her brother. But besides the cuts all over his feet, as she's looking at his body, his skin looked totally normal. He looked completely unhurt. And so Marie turned up to look at Joau's face again to ask him more questions in hopes maybe he could tell her something. And it was at that moment she noticed that even though he didn't seem to have any other injuries, his complexion on his face was now starting to change. Now Joau's cheeks had turned this kind of dark purple and almost looked like they were starting to swell. And so at this point, Marie knew, okay, I can't handle this. I don't know what's going on here. And so she would stand up and just kind of back away from Joau, who's still got that grimace with his teeth exposed and his purple cheeks. He's staring up at Marie. And Marie, she finally backs out and she goes out the front door and she begins running to the other side of town. Marie knew that there were two other men who had stayed home from this festival. It was the town sheriff and the town doctor, whose name was Arasi Gumiji. And those two men lived close together on the other side of town. And when Marie arrived in front of their homes and began pounding on their doors and yelling for help, the two men quickly came outside, at which point Marie tried to explain what was happening to her brother, but she didn't really have the words, and so she just said, "He needs your help." And so the two men just went with Marie, and they ran back across town to Marie's house, where Joau was still on the ground, writhing in pain when they went inside. Marie had only been gone for a couple of minutes, but by now it wasn't just Joau's cheeks that had turned that purplish color. His chest and arms were also turning purple. At this point, the sheriff leaned over Joau and began asking him some questions, and Joau, he was obviously in horrible pain from something, but by this point he had calmed down enough to where he was speaking a little bit more, but what he was saying made no sense. He told the sheriff that he had been followed home and then he got burned. And when the sheriff asked him, "Who burned you?" all Joau could say was, "No one is to blame." At this point, the sheriff left Marie's house and jogged over to Joau's house to look for some sign of how he got burned. But when he got there, the house was completely unburned. Everything was exactly as it should have been. There was no scorch marks. There was not even a lit candle anywhere. So there was no clues as to what happened to Joau. By the time the sheriff got back to Marie's, it had been about 45 minutes from when Joau first got hurt, and now whatever was happening to his body that was turning him purple appeared to be getting much worse. Joau's skin all over his face and his chest and his arms was now not only a very dark purple, but his skin was starting to blister and pop. In fact, there was one area on his arm that had bubbled up so much that when it burst, you could actually see the bone in his arm. It was almost like Joau had been boiled in water, like the way you would boil meat on a bone until the meat was tender enough that it fell off the bone. It was like that was happening to Joau. And so as Joau's flesh just sort of began cooking off of him, the town doctor, Arasi, said, "We have to get him to a hospital right now." But because the roads were not paved and it was dangerous traveling at night, they knew they couldn't get him to the big city hospital. They would have to take him to a local hospital. And so the sheriff, who had a truck, said, "Let's just put him in the truck and I will drive him there." And so Arasi, the sheriff, and Marie, they got a new sheet, they wrapped up Joau inside of it, and they brought him outside, they put him in the sheriff's truck, and they began driving towards the hospital. Arasi stayed in the back with Joau as they made this drive, and every time the truck went over a bump, Joau would let out a cry of pain, and Arasi would look over and he would literally see these bumps were causing his skin to kind of fall off of his body. When they finally arrived at the local hospital, the staff there pulled Joau inside, they put him in a private room, they put him on a bed, and they had no idea how to treat him. It was like his injuries looked nothing like they had ever seen. They didn't even know where to begin, and they kind of assumed that Joau would not survive whatever was happening to him. And so the first thing they did is just pumped him full of painkillers. And while these painkillers didn't actually do anything to stop basically Joau's body from decomposing while he was still alive, they did at least allow Joau to stop feeling this horrible pain of his flesh falling off of him. And so Joau finally just kind of sunk back in his bed. And the sight of him must have just been horrific. He literally had huge chunks of his flesh just missing. I mean, literally parts of his skeleton were exposed to the naked eye. After the doctors had gotten Joau as stable as they could get him, Arasi, the local town doctor, sat down next to Joau and just began asking him questions. And for the first time, Joau was able to talk somewhat normally because he was on such a high dose of painkillers. And so Arasi began asking Joau to go over everything that happened from the time he left fishing for catfish until he arrived at his house and got burned. This is roughly what Joau told Arasi. He said on his walk home from fishing, he started getting that feeling that he was being watched. And it got more and more intense as he got into town until finally he basically sprinted the rest of the way to his house, practically dove through that open window, shut it behind him, and expected to feel relief being in his own home again. But he didn't. The feeling only intensified that he was being watched. And at some point, he got that sense that whoever or whatever was watching him was to his left out the window out into his yard. And when Joau turned to look, what he saw standing outside was this dark figure kind of hovering over the ground, and it was staring right at Joau. And before Joau could even put his hands up to protect himself from whatever or whoever this was, this figure shot this bright ray of light directly into Joau's home through that window, which hit Joau in the chest and the face. And immediately Joau was blinded and confused by this light, and then it really started to burn. He believed he was on fire, which is why he grabbed that blanket and wrapped it around himself. He was trying to put out a non-existent fire, and that's when he stumbled outside and kind of zigged and zagged, kind of half trying to put this fire out until he arrived at Marie's house. But when he got there, that sensation of feeling like he was on fire didn't go away. It just got worse and worse and worse, and then his skin began falling off. When Arasi asked Joau, who do you think did this to you? Who do you think that figure was? And Joau, with bulging eyes, would sit forward and say to Arasi, "It wasn't of this world." And as Joau said this, a chunk from his cheek fell off, exposing his jaw and teeth. And as this happened, Joau asked one of the nurses for a water. And so Arasi is sitting there having heard the story as Joau, who's all hopped up on painkillers, is grabbing this water and drinking, and Arasi is watching the water dribble out of the hole now on the side of Joau's face. About 4 hours later, Joau would pass away from his injuries. There has never been any official explanation for what actually happened to Joau. The doctors just wrote cardiac arrest and generalized burns on his death certificate because they really had no idea what else to call this. Joau's family believed the Boitata, the ancient serpent that lived in the forest and appeared at night in a ball of fire, was responsible for what happened to Joau. Other people in town thought maybe it was the monsters or demons from the old abandoned mine that had come out and attacked Joau. Outside of Joau's town, people have theorized that Joau must have been subjected to some really high dose of radiation, and so this theory has led people to believe that, perhaps Joau was the victim of a secret weapon that the government was testing. But to create such a concentrated beam of radiation that only affects Joau would be way more technologically advanced than anything that was available at the time in the world. Not to mention, why would any government randomly target a Brazilian farmer with this weapon? But Joau would not be the only person in Brazil to die from mysterious rays of light. In the 1970s, so 30 years after Joau's death, several people in a city in northern Brazil reported seeing bright lights coming down from the sky, and then they too began turning purple and their skin began falling off and they would die. And so because of this high number of very strange deaths that looked just like Joau's, a new theory has taken root over the years to explain what happened to Joau and these people. And that is, they were attacked by a UFO. That Joau, when he looked out the window and saw that dark figure hovering over the ground, that was a UFO, and the light he saw was a weapon. The UFO was firing a ray of radiation that struck him and killed him like it struck and killed the others in Brazil. The military actually looked into this theory in 1977 and 1978. It was called Operation Saucer, like flying saucer. However, officially, they came out and said they found no evidence that UFOs were in any way involved in what happened to Joau or these other people. However, many people are skeptical that we're really getting the truth.
Night is folding softly in my hands. Another chapter drifting with the sand. I've carried echoes heavier than stone, but every dawn reminds me I'm not alone. The wind begins to whisper where to go, and suddenly the past feels lighter than before. We're leaving footprints on tomorrow, stepping out from all the sorrow, running toward the sun that breaks the night, chasing dreams that
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen's podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone.
Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham.